Welcome. This is the 141st edition of Europe Calling today in cooperation with the association StopEcocide in Germany. So that's our topic, Ecocide, because in 1 week, the World Nature Conference is going to start in Montreal. So we are going to talk about the most serious environmental crimes. I am Maximilian Fries, managing director for Europe Calling, and I would like to welcome our guests. I'm going to introduce them in more detail later on. As always, with Europe Calling, you can ask your questions and then also evaluate other people's questions, vote them up or down. We're using, we can vote them up, not down, sorry. We're using Slido. You can see the link for that in the chat and on the slide just now. That's where you can ask your questions, and then we're going to repeat the questions that have gotten the most votes. And as always, Europe Calling is recorded and will be on YouTube later on. So don't forget that if you're going to ask questions. So that's all in terms of technical organizational topics. I'd like to now welcome Wolf Hingst, StopEcocide Germany. You have the floor, Wolf. Welcome. I'm happy that we have so many people who are interested in listening to us, and I would also like to thank all our speakers. I would like to start with a few words from a German point of view. Few people know this, even those who know about international law. In the original Roman statute, ecocide was in one of the drafts. So this idea to make it a crime isn't actually something new. It was something that should be taken up again. Weirdly, I had been taken out of the draft. That's just what I wanted to say. And I wanted to point out the German situation, which is quite specific. On the one hand, in Germany, I think we're important for this topic because we have this economic power in Europe and in the world. And at the same time, the topic of ecocide in Germany in comparison to other European countries isn't something that has gained as much attention as other European countries. Maybe you've noticed this. It's still something rather new. Even the word is quite unknown. Even larger environmental associations, Greenpeace and the BUND, just find it a strange concept, even though it would make their work a lot easier if we had a law against environmental crimes. It should be something positive for all associations, but it is still something rather strange for Germans, and that's due to the word ecocide. That is something that we're quite sensitive towards in Germany because of our historical responsibility. Ecocide is very close to the word genocide. So it might sound like playing down the Holocaust if you're using it for something to do with the environment. So because of that moral outrage that is the reaction, if you're using the word, I would say it proves that it's the right word, the right term, because it is about morals as well, about values, because international law especially does also relate to the moral constitution of our societies, so that there is a consensus about a red line that we are not ready to accept. And what we are accepting, what we don't define as a crime, what we can tolerate, that isn't defined in the way or restricted in the way that it should be. And my last remark, also related to Germany, international law as we know it at the moment, has emerged in Nuremberg after the Second World War, in parts, the Nuremberg court procedures. So that's why the German perspective is a little bit different. That was my introduction. Thank you. Now I'm just trying to go back. Thank you for this introduction. I'm going to continue with Hannes Jaenicke. I would like to welcome you. I think many of you know him. He's an author, filmmaker, actor, and activist for the environment. He's German American, so he lives both in LA and in Bavaria. Many of you know him because he's worked to protect orangutans, which is a project that took place a little longer ago. For his work, he tends to travel to those places where the most serious environmental crimes, the ecocide, can actually take place. So I'm looking forward to your report from the front lines. I know your last project was in Costa Rica, and you're just busy making that film. So what is it that you saw there? This is a series for the ZDF under the title Im Einsatz für. I just use the animals in order to illustrate the environmental catastrophe and attract a mass audience. It's not about animal welfare for me. So what it was about in the first place was palm oil production, illegal wood cutting, rainforest destruction. But I do need an emotional incentive, a trigger, and that was the orangutan for that. And then we continued with the ice, with the polar bears in the northeast of Canada. And now I'm busy making this film about sea turtles. There are 7 species, and they're all in serious danger of extinction for the reasons you all know: plastics in the sea, contamination, and also the rising sea levels, because the sea turtles have been building their nests for centuries, the same places in the beach. They work 100, 150 meters up the beach, and then that's where they dig in their eggs, and then they leave them. But if the sea levels rise too much, then of course the sea will reach, the tides will reach that, and the baby turtles cannot hatch, because after about 140 days, when they would be ready to hatch, then there are no more eggs, and that will be the definitive end of this beautiful species. And there are lots of knock-on effects. Coral reefs will also suffer because there are some coral reefs that need to be eaten and cared about by sea turtles, and otherwise there is too much proliferation and the loss of color. And there are other turtles that are eating other animals in the sea, and we have all of this proliferation of species that sea turtles are supposed to eat, like jellyfish, and that is my work. And it doesn't matter where you go at the moment, outside of Central and Northern Europe, the climate damages are very visible in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, the rain period is now 2 weeks instead of 2 months, and that's also true in the entire southwestern part of Africa, Mozambique and around. So if it's really bad, there'll be flooding like last year. For us, if there's not a flood like last year in Germany, then we can still afford to overlook what's happening. And that's why the term ecocide is so important, because we have to see how much suffering there is. And the climate change isn't affecting us enough. And that's our task as activists, as filmmakers, making documentaries, showing that it's not just a few islands in the southern Pacific, but it's here in Brandenburg, in pine forests and permafrost in the Zugspitze, the highest mountain in Germany. So it's really it has arrived here, climate change. That's why I work for these projects. Question. So what you're describing is really a crisis that has come to a head for years now in terms of climate change. We've also talked about Edinburgh. earlier. So for you and for other artists or filmmakers that who are making documentaries, can you see a reaction or a change? Is there any change to your work because the crisis has gotten worse and worse? If you're looking back to 2006, can you see any changes in your work because it's so clear what's happening, even if you saw it coming 16 years ago? My work hasn't really changed, no. But the documentaries are no longer a niche product. I mean, if you're a Netflix subscriber, you can see What the Health, Seaspiracy, and so on. It's a mass product now. So it's new hot shit, as we say in the States. So everyone wants documentaries. There really is a need for real information, and that wasn't the case when I started. It was really hard to even get broadcasters to broadcast documentaries at a good time to find a slot. So that demand has gone up in terms of the broadcaster stations, the producers and the audience. So it is a time for documentaries, even for these hot topics. And another things that changed the BBC, for instance, is trying to show they started out showing the beauty of the world in order to get a positive incentive to protect it, and now their films are a little bit harder. I have started with a bit of a shock factor. So I had a prostitute female orangutan, and this female orangutan costs 50 cents. A female human was €3, and we filmed the castration of this female orangutan, and that really drove up people stopping to watch. I mean, at the moment, there's a lot, Ukraine crisis, South Sudan, everywhere there's crisis. And I think that's why at the moment I'm a little bit more careful with shocking pictures and shopping topics. So I'm more careful at the moment. I try to give people a break. I did a film about mass animal husbandry, about pigs, but I did not show how they squeezed to death. I just try to show how intelligent pigs are and how what a sociable animal they are. And I did not actually show any pictures from slaughterhouses. So it changes. Sometimes I try to give the audience a shock treatment, and sometimes I'm softer. That depends on how many other crises people have to tolerate at the same time. I think that was a good framework. Thank you very much to Jojo Mehta. Let me briefly enlarge her. She is co-founder of StopEcocide Foundation with the now deceased Polly Higgins. Many of you might know her. She was the managing director of this organization, and she studied in Great Britain, and I used to study in Cambridge, so I really like her accent. It's so nice and British, and I'm looking forward to hearing it now. Jojo, please, you have the floor. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Ecocide is a word that is increasingly being used around the world to refer to mass damage and destruction of the environment. And etymologically, it means, from the Greek and Latin, to kill one's home. And so it feels like a very apt way to describe what is happening to the planet at the present time. As Hannes has just pointed out, we are at a point of emergency. And what we can feel today globally, at all levels, in my experience, is a deep and rising frustration with the lack of action, or perhaps I should say the painfully slow pace of action to address this. Action which would actually be appropriate to the crisis we all face, and also to the tragic loss of nature that Hannes evoked so well. Criminalizing mass harm to nature, or ecocide, could make a powerful paradigm level difference. Even if all emissions ceased tomorrow, if we continue to destroy forests, pollute oceans, destroy key carbon sinks and vital ecosystems, we will continue to suffer from climate and ecological crisis. Ecocide law could address the destruction that is at a root cause of ecological breakdown, holding government and corporate actors to account and acting as a protective safeguard and deterrent. But not only that, it could act as an enabling framework, inspiring the urgent adaptive thinking that we know is desperately needed. Because when we know what we must avoid, it becomes so much easier to work out and to support the solutions that we need. It levels the playing field for the adaptive and regenerative work which is already being done and which is currently an uphill struggle. StopEcocide International has been working for 5 years now, developing global cross-sector support for this law, ultimately aiming for its inclusion in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And recent developments have been remarkable and rapid. Before 2019, no governments were known to be talking about this. Now, discussion of ecocide law is on public record at parliament and/or government level in no fewer than 25 countries which are signatories to the Rome Statute. From parliamentary petitions to government resolutions to full proposals of law, the range of engagement is wide and it varies, but we can say with confidence that this is a serious diplomatic conversation which is firmly in progress. And there have been some key milestones, in particular, the emergence of a consensus legal definition of ecocide. Last year, our charitable foundation convened an expert panel of top legal minds from around the world to work on this. And the resulting definition has, in the short time since its launch in June last year, it has become the de facto starting point for international diplomatic discussions, as well as national and regional ones. For example, in Belgium, where the government has recently proposed recognition of a crime of ecocide in its own penal code. And in the EU, where there is growing support for the inclusion of ecocide into the Directive on Environmental Crimes, which is currently under revision. And the core of the definition is balanced and concise. And it's so concise, in fact, that it fits on the back of a business card. I was going to show it on a slide, but I like doing that because it's more fun. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And this definition was presented to the Assembly of States Parties at the International Criminal Court last December in an event that was supported by 3 of the world's most climate vulnerable states, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Bangladesh. In July of this year, when the ICC celebrated its 20th anniversary in The Hague with a one-day conference on the past, present, and future of the court, a significant proportion of the future section was dedicated to the possible addition of a crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute. Just a few weeks ago, Vanuatu's president, Vurubaravu, called on the UN General Assembly to support recognition of ecocide alongside other legal avenues. And that same week, the Pivot Point Report, as it was called, launched by the Race to Zero Climate Champions, the UN initiative, included a significant section on ecocide law, describing it as a key driver towards net zero. And businesses have already begun to sign an open letter to governments calling for this law. Official statements to COP27 issued by global youth and faith networks have called for ecocide law. And the International Corporate Governance Network, an investor-led network of the world's biggest financial firms and banks, has just now, at COP27 again, for the second year in a row, called on governments to collaborate internationally to criminalize ecocide. And that was a quote from their recommendations. So as you can hear, this is a conversation that is going to grow louder. And most importantly, it is a conversation that Europe, and of course Germany as a key European and indeed global player, can have a concrete and powerful influence in progressing. And indeed, one could argue, has a duty to progress, to show how, with the right legal frameworks, policy and finance can flow in a healthier direction, in harmony with the living world, and of course, in support of those countries most at risk right now from climate and ecological disaster. And we hope and trust that Germany, as that key player, will join the growing number of countries seriously discussing this. Because the time is right for this law. Indeed, it is long overdue. And by working together, it can be put in place. Thank you very much.
Great speech.
Herzlichen Dank.
Don't expect too much from Germany, though.
Thank you very much.
We'll see. We'll see. Da reden wir gleich noch drüber in der Diskussion.
That will be the topic of our discussion, and I'm really anxious to see how our panelists see the chances we have to get something from Germany. But now we're going to listen to somebody who maybe can answer this question already. Mrs. Dr. Dana Schirwon, a lawyer, and since June 2022, she works for the German Council of Foreign Relations, DGAP. She told me that she's also an advisor for the Foreign Ministry of Annalena Baerbock when it comes to foreign climate policy. So we're really very interested in hearing what you can tell us today, Dana Schirwon, based on your experience. You have the floor. Thank you very much, dear Max. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Europe Calling, for the organization of this webinar. I'd like to speak about three important topics now. I'd like to link up with what Jojo has mentioned, i.e. the connection between international climate protection and the introduction of an ecocide element of crime. And then I'd like to speak about the international law framework for this type of crime, because it's an international crime. And then I'd like to talk about the current developments in the EU. First of all, as to the connection, because international climate protection and the creation of ecocide as an element of crime. This is not so obvious because an eco-crime as such is not something which is connected by people in general with the climate crisis. This is because we have a very problematic understanding of the nature and of our planet, which is also reflected in our legal order, because the nature is not only there for us and can thus be exploited shamelessly. No, we are all part of the nature. And the concept of the planetary security is a very important term, which Hannes Jaenicke also mentioned when he was talking about sea turtle, i.e. that there is a close connection between a good nature and an good ecosystem and human beings and their security. These topics cannot be disassociated from one another. And therefore, the good health of our nature is a very important security target and contributes also to climate protection. And that's where we have to talk about ecocide as a crime. Because severe destructions of the environment and of ecosystems would thus become criminal act. In the context of the climate crisis, this would play a very important role. Laws have a very protective law, and the nature protects us against the extreme weathers. Even if we manage to reach 1.5% global warming, we will have in the near future a lot of extreme weather events. And if ecosystems are in order, then they can protect human beings. Furthermore, there are several ecosystems which bind CO2, the carbon sinks, for example. That's why these ecosystems are so important for reaching the 1.5 degree target, as Jojo has mentioned. A sad example, which I think many know, is the Amazon rainforest, where the Bolsonaro administration was guilty of large deforestation. The Amazon rainforest is worldwide one of the largest carbon sinks, i.e. a lot of emitted CO2 or carbon is bound there. But according to a study last year, the rainforest for the first time ever emitted more CO2 than it absorbed. And this is a horrible repercussion on the global climate, but also on the regional climate. And the community of states in the world has to just observe things and can do nothing. But it could be an eco-crime if there were the international possibility in international law to prosecute such crimes. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, would thus have a possibility to act, to do something against such eco-crimes, for example, in the Amazon rainforest, and take the responsible people to court. So that could be very important for climate protection in general. And the element of crime of ecocide could thus contribute to protect our climate worldwide. I'd like to say something on the context of the international criminal law. International criminal law, as it is stipulated in the Roman Statute, comprises the worst crimes which threaten the international state community as such, i.e. international crimes against humanity, against peace, in order to protect our most valuable values. The statute has been existing since 1998. It's a treaty according to international law. Germany as a state was one of the founding states. And the Statute of Rome is at the same time the legal base for the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But it's important to know that before the International Criminal Court, not states are taken to justice, but persons. So the norms which we have in the Statute of Rome are also in our legal code in Germany. Ecocide currently, as has been mentioned, is not part of the Roman Statute, at least not entirely. Worst eco-crimes currently can only be punished according to war crimes in times of war. For example, what the Russian army commits as crimes in the Ukraine currently, that could be prosecuted if investigations show that they are environmental crimes. Then they could be judged according to international law. What's also interesting at the moment is the international development in the European Union, because here already since the end of the last year, there has the European Union has been discussing the amendment of the European Criminal Law Eco-Crime Directive, because the EU presented a draft for its reform, and in the preamble, ecocide was mentioned, but only as an example for a particularly serious eco-crime. But in the articles, ecocide was not mentioned anymore. And a few weeks ago, there was a new development, because toward the end of October, the ENVI Committee for Environmental Questions advocated for ecocide as a aggravating circumstance in the law, i.e. that if criminal acts are as severe, are so severe that they can be qualified as ecocide, then the act would become a very serious criminal offense. And that would mean automatically in Germany, for example, that we would have to go to jail. And as to this eco-crime directive, we have to say that the consultations in the member states are still pending. It's a long process. Also in Germany, there are consultations in the Federal Ministry for the Environment and Consumer Protection. And it will be very interesting to see how the federal government will position itself in the future and in the course of the next year. If ecocide, according to this draft or recommendation, would be incorporated into the directive, it would mean that the member states would have to transpose this provision in their national laws. But it doesn't mean that ecocide is punishable automatically because there is this directive. There will be a certain deadline for the implementation or the transposition of this directive that will take a few years. But at the end, serious eco-crimes would be an aggravating circumstance for certain crimes. And this would mean that people, if they are actually sentenced, would be sentenced to jail. And that's interesting because in German law, criminal law, eco-crime is not a crime, but just a simple offense. But what we have now is at the European level. This doesn't mean that we have automatically an international possibility to punish eco-crime. In Germany, this would only be the case in the context of the Rome Statute. And this would mean that in this case, internationally, you could do something against the deforestation. For example, in Brazil, you could investigate those people in Germany and bring them to court or before the European Court of Justice. But I'm quite optimistic thanks to the current developments. And I think that the discussion in the next year will be really, really exciting. And I really hope that Annalena Baerbock and the German government in general will face up to this problem in the context of the EU. They won't have another choice. Thank you very much. That's all from me for the moment. Thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear these legal aspects. I can add that the Federal Ministry of Justice has been contacted by us, and they would have liked to come, but they had in the end, they had problems because they were not available tonight to participate here in our seminar. Before I give the floor to Hermann Ott, I would like to mention that when we talk about the EU agreed on a supply chain law, which is very important in the context of Ecocide too, because that's in the end, there could be an economic prosecution of certain types of eco-crimes. So at the European level, things are moving, and this will be a topic later on. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Hermann Ott. Hermann, for a long time, you were at the Wuppertal Institute. You're a lawyer yourself, and you're currently the leader of the German office of Client Earth, the International Environmental Association. You probably know the name because you have gone to court in the context of many eco-crimes. You're very active in this field, but you do other things. But I think this is something which Hermann can tell you himself. I think you also were a member of the German Bundestag for the Greens, Alliance 90. And now I would like to give the floor. We are really happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Max. Well, I'm glad to be able to speak here today, and I really appreciate this event. It has been pointed out how long we've been talking about this ever since the 70s already, ever since Richard Falk started talking about this, that in connection with the American Army's actions in the Vietnam forest. And sometimes these discussions sort of start and then are forgotten about, and then they start up again. So I hope that this time we will have real progress. And I think that is possible because it's a topic at the international level, that it could be the fifth crime under the ICC statutes, the Rome Statute, and Jojo also pointed out in how many countries ecocide is already a crime. And there are other countries like Great Britain, where Parliament rejected that notion. And we do not have any legal practice. There's never been a case at a national court in order to decide about ecocide as a crime. So we still have a ways to go, but we're on the way at least. And in Germany, the discussion is quite recent, is quite still at its beginning. There are individual politicians demanding ecocide as a crime, but there are, above all, civil society movements to stop ecocide, and they're very passionate and also know a lot about the topic. So when you start establishing something as a crime, designating something as a crime, then you have to have very sound reasons. So it's not enough to just say we have environmental law already. Dana Schirwon has pointed out what's there in international criminal law, and in Germany, in our criminal code, we have quite a number of crimes against the environment. The air, the soil are protected. You can't just run a facility without authorization. You cannot trade with radioactive substances. So there is quite a lot, and there are heavy sanctions and penalties in some cases. So it can go up to 10 years in prison. So it's not nothing. The problem so far, the fact that if you have an authorization, so if they're in administrative terms, you have that authorization to do what you're doing, then normally this environmental crime will not be sanctioned. So that's quite a big restriction, because a lot of other things that damage the climate, etc., a lot of the things that damage the climate or the environment are happening after having obtained an authorization from the administration. So that means that we're missing a crime because of the climate damage. And now, after all the destruction that we've seen on our planet, entire species disappearing, as Jaenicke pointed that out, and there are hundreds of thousands more such examples. Such crimes cannot be punished at all, not in Germany and not in many other countries either. So that establishing ecocide as a crime would also get us away from focusing on humans as the core and the center of all our laws and how they're made, how they're used. And we would then have nature and the environment at the center, in order to make it very clear that laws are not just there to protect humans, but laws are here to protect all life on this planet. And that's why we have that title, Client Earth. Earth is our client. So we're here to protect our Earth and everything that lives on our planet. So that is the larger framework here. So the efforts to designate ecocide at all the different levels as a crime, that is connected with trying to also change people's perceptions and attitude, because at the moment we really see humans as the pinnacle of all life, and we believe that we have the right to decide what life should be on the planet, can be on the planet, and how much of it. So I think that that is one of the most basic reasons, or biggest reasons, why there's a lack of progress. So without that change in perception and attitude, we're not going to be successful to come to a good kind of coexistence between humans and all other living beings. Hannes Jaenicke also pointed out that the arts can contribute to that kind of change of attitude. So the law is just one way to do it. There are many cultural, social factors that can influence our thinking and our awareness and how we see our relationship to the environment and to life on this planet. But the law has a specific position, because if you look at the pyramid of ethics, let's say, the law is at the top. It's highly regarded, because if something is legally wrong, so illegal and even criminal, then that means that it is regarded to have a higher value, is considered to have a higher value, and that can change people's thinking and to really consider the rights of other living beings. And I think that belongs to the topic of ecocide, even though these are two separate movements, really. But I think that they're both working towards the same goal. And now I'm going to conclude by saying that that would open up new ways for citizens to take action. We've heard it in international criminal law that one of the biggest disadvantages is that normally only states can bring a complaint against other states. At the ICC, that's different. Even private persons or associations can sue. And they can bring a claim the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And that, of course, is similar under national law. So we have the so-called right to sue for association, legal standing for associations. So environmental associations can bring complaints if authorities or companies violate the law against the environment. But if we criminalize such behavior, that makes a difference. If it's just the company that has to pay, even if it's a higher sanction, that's different than being liable as a person, as the manager of a company. And that could also help changing the thinking of the heads of companies. Thank you. Thank you, Wolf. So, thank you, everyone. I can see the questions, but before we really start with all the questions, I would like to talk to our lawyers again, Jojo and Professor Hermann Ott. So let's be a little bit more concrete. You mentioned Bolsonaro, Jojo. So if there had been a crime by Bolsonaro when he was president, luckily that's over, what exactly would have happened? So what's your idea? How would it work specifically? Because these are the questions. What exactly would happen if Bolsonaro or somebody else committed such a crime? For instance, Coca-Cola. They produce most plastic in the world, and a lot of that ends up in the ocean. We all know the pictures, the images. So what exactly would change if ecocide was a crime under the ICC? Maybe Jojo can start, and then Dana and Hermann as well. Let's really look at the step-by-step things that would happen in such a case. I think that's interesting for our audience.
So I think looking at a case such as Bolsonaro, for example, what we're looking at is, and Dr. Dana pointed this out, that the ICC, we are looking at individual criminal responsibility, and I think that's one of the important aspects here, because it means that even heads of state, and I think that's why you're taking that example of Bolsonaro, even heads of state are not immune to justice being carried out effectively. There are several ways of a case being taken at the ICC. I mean, it can be it can be referred to by a state, but it can also be referred to by an individual or civil society member under Article 15 of the Rome Statute. And there's also the possibility of the UN Security Council referring something to the ICC. So there are several ways that could be done. And effectively, what's I suppose the thing that's a really sort of primary difference actually just between criminal law and administrative, or in common law, civil law, is that what you don't have is individual citizens or communities against the party that's accused, where it's a sort of, effectively that's a kind of private situation, which most sort of environmental litigation at the moment is in that kind of category. Once something is in a criminal category, it's more, it's more about reporting that something is happening, and the state, or obviously at the, if it's at the highest level, such as a head of state, the ICC then takes a prosecution. So what you're doing is you're kind of creating a very different sort of framework, because at the moment, in cases of environmental damage, often a community is left to somehow gather some funds to create a case against a company, for example. Whereas if you've got a criminal situation with individual responsibility, then if what you're doing is handing that over to the state, or ultimately to the International Criminal Court to prosecute. So it's a very sort of different scenario. But before you move on to the other lawyers, I just also want to make a point here that the power of this law is not just in what will happen once the law is in place. It's already having an effect now. Because, and I think it's also quite important to note that this law would not be retroactive. So it's not about putting something in place you can then go back and find the people who have potentially been at fault beforehand. It doesn't work like that. But it's actually quite important that it doesn't, because ultimately we are all on the same potentially sinking ship. And ultimately, we need to change behavior. So criminal law is really about that. Ultimately, murder is a crime, not to punish the murderers, but to prevent people from being killed. So the whole point of criminalizing mass harm to nature and being able to see that law approaching is so that anyone who will need to be thinking about that, whether that's, policymakers, key decision makers in industry, can effectively be saying, right, well, if this is coming into play within the next few years, what are the questions we need to ask now? And that is why it was so important to have it acknowledged in that report from the UN climate champions, because what they're saying is actually knowing that law is approaching is already starting to have an effect in terms of, what people are investing in, what they're underwriting if they're insurers, what they're authorizing as board members, for example. And that's a really important aspect as well. Thank you.
Soll ich weitermachen?
Du kannst gerne weitermachen und ich gebe dir.
You want me to continue? Yes, no problem. But I would like to give the floor to Hermann, who raised his hands, and then Dana, or you can leave Dana the first word. Yes, I'd like to say that we have an institution deficit. It's not by accident that most cases which have to do with the environment or international environmental protection are dealt with by international courts of justice, because that's where people can sue their own government. There was one case in the Court for Human Rights in Geneva. These were the inhabitants of the Strait Islands who belong to Australia, who brought a complaint against its own government in Geneva, and they won their case, i.e. the Australian government has to do more to protect their own government, these people who live on these islands, and have to pay them compensation. So we need more possibilities also on the national level to do something, so that citizens can do something. And Ecocide was one of the parts which contribute to that. Thank you very much. And I'd like to mention a question by somebody I know, Hans-Dieter Fell, a member of the German Parliament for the Greens. And Hans-Josef asks, global warming is the mother of all environmental destruction, and can lead to the destruction of human civilization, i.e. the largest ecocide. But global warming is the result of billions of human beings, companies, politicians. How could an element of crime, ecocide, therefore bring something in terms of ecocide? And I know that you made a video on the question. That's why I was going to mention this. Yes, that's right. It also has to do with what I said at the beginning, i.e. that the introduction of the element of crime for ecocide cannot solve the climate crisis in one go. We need several instruments, but this element of crime would be one legal possibility, as Jojo and Hermann have already explained. I'd like to talk also about the question how it would be possible, for example, to take Bolsonaro to court, to the ICC. And I think this could explain quite well. Also in the case of a coal power plant, which is often mentioned when we talk about ecocide, that the operation of such a plant could be a punishable criminal act. So if we could go to the European Court of Justice, and they could sue Bolsonaro or others who are, for example, responsible for plastics pollution. There are three ways we could go to the court. The court could investigate itself. They have a large authority for it, which is doesn't have enough resources, but they're well trained. And then once they find evidence for the suspicion, then they would go before the CTH and would sue the relevant persons. But there are certain limitations, because you can only sue if either the country, normally the country in which the offense was committed, has subscribed to the Rome Statute. And this is often a large problem. And then there is the other possibility, which was also set up in order to find out of this quagmire, namely that if you have to deal with a state which is not a member of that statute, but has committed such crimes, then you need another institution. And that should be the Security Council. In the 90s, people were quite optimistic and thought that in the future, the Security Council could be the peacekeeping institution. But I think we all agree that currently this doesn't look like a very realistic option, especially if you think about somebody like Bolsonaro. I think you really have to doubt that relevant majorities could be found in the Security Council. And then the third possibility would be to go via the assembly of the contracting parties or states. I think that would need the majority of all the states who are a member of the Rome Statute, 123 at the moment. I don't know whether they need a qualified majority, but it's also quite a high hurdle, one has to say. So it's not so easy to really sue somebody before the ESTGH. But there is another international vehicle, according to the World Rights Principle, something which was mentioned last year. Last year, Syrian Secret Service officers who were mainly responsible for the fact that human beings had been tortured and killed in Syrian jails, they were taken to court in Germany and were prosecuted and sentenced in Germany. The person had fled his country, was recognized in Berlin, and then on the basis of international criminal law, despite the fact that he didn't commit the crime in Germany and that he's not a German citizen, he was prosecuted on the basis of this legal base. And that could be an interesting instrument which could follow from an element of crime if we had it in the Statute of Rome. The worst problem for the environment is probably carbon emissions. And it's very difficult in this respect to measure exactly who emitted how much. But in the meantime, we have found means and ways to make states responsible or energy producers. The German energy producer RWE, for example. But in the law, it's not quite clear, especially as to the decision who has caused the crime in the first place. But nevertheless, that would have an important effect. It would be a signal also for energy producers that if this carbon emissions continue, then people won't be in a position anymore to just say that what they have done were just administrative acts. In Germany, we will shut down our coal power plants, but other states may not opt for phasing out coal, may continue to operate their coal industries. And this would mean that in the worst case, these companies would risk that the persons who work for them are liable. And that would also be a compliance problem, and that would be a very important signal, and could thus be a very good contribution, a very far-reaching contribution. This would not be a direct connection. We would still have a few other conditions we would have to fulfill, but this would also be a very important contribution of the element of crime of ecocide to climate protection. Thank you very much. We have become relatively concrete now, I think. And now I would like to give the floor to Hannes Jaenicke, because Roland Vossebrecker asked a question. He said that there is a massive criminalization of the last generation activists. And could you compare this to the real eco crimes? And then something else with James Stange wrote for you. He said, I really respect your films and your other actions. Would it be even more efficient if you participated in last generations, if you would be present there? Your presence there would really be something which would have a huge effect, even if you don't glue yourself to the road. So what do you think? Could you be on the road in the streets in the near future? Because we have these activists who glue themselves to the tarmac. And what do you think? What do you think of the proposal of James Stange? First of all, I would like to say that I think the motivation of last generation is perfect. About the ways you can discuss. I find it horrible how Germany treats these people. We talk with a lot of passion about preventive apprehension of these people, the CDU, or people who compare them to RAF terrorists. Well, I think these people are really stupid. So I think, yeah, I think I'll join these people next time they go on the streets. I haven't been invited by last generation so far, but I support absolutely the motives of these people. My way was to write books and to shoot movies, because I think we have a deficit of action, but in certain parts of the population, we have also an information deficit. Why do we still eat salmon? Why do 3 million people go on cruise ships? Why is the car that is most sold in Germany is the SUV? So I think there are just there are some people who know what it's all about, but don't act. The politicians, the industry, but there are other people who also need more information. And then another topic: why is ecocide so important? Then I mentioned this request in Karlsruhe against the federal government. for lack of action. I was there together with Greenpeace in this action. We won the case, but nothing happened. We were so euphorized by this surprising success in Karlsruhe that we got together with two Austrian associations and tried to bring Bolsonaro before the court in The Hague for crimes against humanity, because ecocide is not an element of crime. And he lost the elections, so it's not that topical anymore. But because of the rainforest, the situation there, the inhabitants, we thought we should do something against Bolsonaro, but it's highly complicated to do something against these people before a court. And I'd like to mention also the case Bayer. We have a legal system, and I'm a lone fighter here. I defend the German system in the USA. Bayer has to pay billions because of the chemicals they use, because each cancer patient who can prove that his disease has to do with what Bayer did can make Bayer liable. But the CEO, the CMO, the CFO of Bayer can go to jail if they sell remedies which contain glyphosate. And with Volkswagen, it was the same thing. In the United States, they paid billions because of the diesel scandal. And in the USA, where they have to pay, it's interesting how well they cope with these things, that Volkswagen, after having paid 20 to 30 billions of fines, are still operative. Wintercom and all the others, if they had to go to jail, things would be different in Germany. Wintercom at least cannot travel to the United States anymore because they would put him to jail right away. I'm not a lawyer, so I listen to Dana and Jojo with fascination, hear how we can manage to have this element of crime so that we can really prosecute those crimes. And somebody who was in Berlin and was with the criminal police, he said, in the BTM part, we have 300 officers in this field, but only 3 in the field of ecocrime. In Hesha, 50 in the field of I mentioned, but only 2 in the field of ecocrime. So which means that we have a law, but we don't really execute it. Then that's really a scandal in Germany. That's all from me. Thank you very much. As to the environmental criminal law in North Rhine-Westphalia, we have a little bit more because we have the office again in North Rhine-Westphalia. So we have about 10 now. And now we have a special guest here.
Kiev, I think.
Somebody who came from Kiev, who is from Kiev, I think.
Hello. I think.
Hello, dear colleagues. Hello. I'm not in Kiev. Sorry, I'm in Paris because I have yesterday meeting committee on Ecocide, and I have the special environmental mission here.
Excellent. But I assume you're not Oleg Bodarenko, correct? So could you maybe just introduce yourself, and then we are super happy to have you, and maybe give us a little intervention about what Ukraine thinks about the ecocide, how the Ukrainian parliament wants to push ecocide as an issue on the international level with everything that's happening right now. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Maximilian. Dear colleagues, my name is Yulia Ovchinnikova. I'm not Oleg Bondarenko. Oleg Bondarenko is the head of our Committee of Environmental Policy and Natural Resources. I'm the member of Ukrainian Parliament, and in our Parliament, I'm the head of subcommittee, which work with forestry policy, protected animals, biodiversity, and European integration. So, an ecocide for me, a special topic because I'm from Donbass. I'm internal displaced person, and of course, I'm 8 years in this war, and I professionally environmentalist because I was the acting dean of the Faculty of Biology, and my PhD thesis on environmental sphere, and I was the acting dean of the first displaced university. It's Vasil Stud-Donetsk National University. And ecocide, for me, topic is very important because I'm also the representative Ukraine in the International Parliamentary Alliance for Recognition of Ecocide. This alliance created by member of European Parliament, Marie Toussaint, and we start this active work for international recognition of the Ecocide. And today I had a meeting with the advocate in France, which work with the international recognition of Ecocide as well. And this person helped us in international support in this sphere. So yes, you know that we have the very difficult situation, and it's really the majority of natural resources have been completely destroyed and damaged, and the environmental damage to soil, water, natural sites is huge. More than 2,000 cases of environmental damage registered, 2 million hectares of the Emerald Network sites under threat of destruction. 20% of protected areas Ukraine are under threat, and more than 20 national parks have been occupied. Forests have been burning. The destruction of civilians and military infrastructures has created a huge amount of waste. So it's this war in our country is real genocide against Ukraine nation and Ukraine state, but at the same time, it's a numerous ecocide against nature and crime against the environment in the whole of Europe, and seriously food security for all global world. So moreover, the Russian Federation resorts to nuclear blackmail and tries to intimidate the whole world. So the catastrophic consequences of the Russian invasion for the environment in Ukraine is an ecocide that requires not only international recognition, but also establishment of a special international monitoring mission to properly document crime against the environmental and create the basis for future compensation from Russia. In our legislative sphere, we have the article of ecocide. This is in our criminal code, this article 441. But we have some problem for realize this article because we need additional changes. For example, the mechanism of realize to the terms of ecological catastrophic and the mass destroyed of the and died of the a lot of animals. So this is legislative problem. It's necessary to work for the new version of criminal code and adapt this new version to the Rome Statute. For us, very important because Ukraine now it's not ratified the Rome Statute, but we all work about this and think we try to implementation the special points to our new version of criminal court. But also we have the two very good signals. At first, on this high level, on the national level as well, is the president, when he had the speech on the G20, Volodymyr Zelensky said about this importance of recognition, the ecocide in Ukraine. Secondly, good signals on my view is the absolutely support the general persecutors, because we had meeting and say about this, our future steps. So, and of course, we call on the members of national parliaments of European countries. We also had meeting in European parliaments with Greens, and we take urgent, all possible urgent actions to help the Ukrainian ecosystem to prevent hardy measures and develop the separate package for environment, as well as the recovery package. We would ask to include special support for restoring the damaged environment. We also try to continue communicated, for example, the prioritize the implementation into the international obligation, as well as criminalize the crime of ecocide at the state level in the European countries, because I know they, for example, in France, I haven't such an article, because it's prevent the global disaster with transboundary consequences. So, and of course, We also need expertise with the Office of Specialized Environmental Prosecutor Office. We need really very international support in this sphere, sharing guidelines with the best practices for the investigation and persecution of environmental crimes, as well as equipment for collecting samples of water, soil, and the field mission of international experts in Ukraine. From the full-scale start, it's from the 24th of February of war. The official, the Office Central of Prosecutor, we have 10 cases about this on this Article 241. But in order for future steps for our country, very important to have the international support in these special cases which fixed the central office of crisis, which starts activity of work from March. So, and of course, we work continue on the international level about these special tribunals for a crime of aggression against Ukraine. And as we know, in France, yesterday they had such solutions. So, and in conclusion, I want to say that, frankly speaking, today nature is a silent witness and victim of this unjust and unprovocated war. And this is aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine is the biggest anthropogenic catastrophe 21st century that dramatically affects people, my country, our environmental, and also other countries in global ecosystem. So nature knows no borders. So it's our common concern, our responsibility, and we would jointly search for a solution together. Thank you very much for the possibility to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank auch für
Thank you. Thank you very much for being so clear. And of course, Ukraine is hasn't ratified the Rome Statute, but there seems to be a lot of support also from the government for the time after the war in order to make sure that ecocide will be designated a criminal offense. We all hope that the war will be over at some point, and it is important to have a strong voice after that. So thank you for joining us, and you're welcome to stay during the discussion. And at this point, I would read out some questions. We have 15 minutes and would like to come back to some question. The next question that is a question by Anne Ruth. I'm going to read it out. I've heard that in other countries, for instance, Spain, a river delta has been giving the right to claim its rights at court. So that is giving a voice to nature. Is something like this possible at the EU level or in Germany? Are there any efforts in that direction? I think Ecuador has something like that in its constitution. So maybe somebody from the panel could talk about the difference between ecocide and rights of the nature. Hermann Ott has raised his hand. Please. Well, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, I had pointed it out that I believe that efforts to give nature itself and other living beings on this planet rights in order to present their own rights, that belongs to the topic of ecocide for me. But so now, in countries with indigenous communities that are quite strong, like New Zealand, Colombia, Ecuador, etc., we can see that there's, I would almost say, this tendency to give Pachamama, as it is called, or nature, voice and legal standing. And that is a complete game changer, because at that point, if nature has this legal standing or rights, like an ecosystem or water courses or mountainous area, then any sort of manipulation has to be there have to be reasons have to be justified. So usually it's the other way around, the burden of proof. But in this case, the burden of proof would be reversed, and the Spanish Parliament has adopted this remarkable act, and I hope that it's going to be a pioneer act for Europe. That's still at the very beginning, but there's a lot of action by civil society there. Jojo, you have the floor on this.
Yes, I just was going to say that there's a kind of complementary relationship between the rights side of things and the criminal law side of things. You know, obviously, I mean, both are important, but I mean, just to give a very simple example, you know, our basic human right is the right to life. But then what protects the right to life is the fact that to take that life is a crime. So effectively, the fact that we have a crime of murder protects our human right to life. And the crime of ecocide would have a bit of a similar relationship with the rights of nature. And indeed, one could say that the newly acknowledged right to a clean, safe and sustainable environment that's just recently been acknowledged at the UN level. So there are those two things. Sometimes people ask, you know, does nature have to have rights in order for ecocide to become a crime? Well, no, that's not the case. I mean, if we think about it, again, to use that simple example, I mean, you know, murder's been a crime for as long as we can think back, but human rights is a relatively new conversation. So, you know, the two things are complementary, but certainly they don't, you know, there's no actual requirement for those rights to be in place in order for ecocide to operate effectively.
Ja, super. Vielen Dank auch nochmal.
Well, thank you again for clearing that up. I think that was important to understand for many people, that it is complementary, but that one doesn't have to be in place for the other to work. So there's another question here that I think is very interesting, and I'm looking to Dana Schirwon, maybe in terms of her work, the Foreign Office. Dana has left us, so I can't look at her, unfortunately. I'm still going to read out the question. So today, CETA, the trade agreement with Canada, was adopted, and then the supply chain law at the European level was also something that happened today. And Christian Werner is asking, wouldn't it make sense to introduce the term ecocide in trade agreements like CETA, so that in free trade agreements, you're not just going to talk about climate protection and the Paris Convention, but also the topic of ecocide. So that's a question to Jojo, but also to Hermann Ott. Is that something, are there any efforts to that way, that ecocide will not just become a criminal offense, but also part of trade agreements? So trade only if there's no ecocide, or what would the link be, the connection?
Ja, ich gehe wieder aufs Deutsche.
Well, back to speaking German, of course. So the sense of such supply chains, free trade agreements, FTAs, is that specific actions should be excluded from trade. That could be social things like exploiting people, child labor, but it could also be ecological criteria. So ecocide would be the biggest possible criterion for not acting, for not being able to trade. That shouldn't be tolerated. Thank you. So we have 9 more minutes. Maybe let's listen to 2-3 questions from the audience by giving them the floor directly. Dr. Karin Ritter-Püchel, you can take the floor now. Dr. Ritter-Püchel, you have the floor. Oh, you don't want to, but you raised your hand. Okay, Claudia Sasse then. You have the floor. Claudia Sasse, just unmute your microphone and then you can speak. Well, sometimes it's great with the questions directly from the audience, but sometimes it takes a while. I'll just go through those who have raised their hand. Uwe Kroner, you have the floor.
Uwe Kroner, gerne das Mikrofon. Wer zuerst spricht, jetzt mache ich die letzte Person mit einer Hand noch. Erwin Karg.
Erwin Karg, the last one who raised his hand, their hand, and then we've tried them all. Claudia Sasse, Erwin Karg, Uwe Kroner. It's probably my fault, Max says. Well, I'm just leaving their microphones open. Maybe they'll manage later. Let's go back and take a look at the questions that we got here. There's a question directly to Professor Ott. Harald Okun asks, what about the decision tonight, the 2nd of December 2022 at 20 past midnight against Lützerath with a view to destroying valuable arable land? How do you see that, Professor Ott? Well, we are very critical towards this decision. That was a deal between the federal government and the government of the land with the utility RWE. And it was really, there was a massive lack of transparency, very doubtful expert opinions were used, and that's what they based their decision on. And in our opinion, well, this is really something that violates the climate protection law, because that says that there should be a continuous phasing out. And now we have this emission bubbles where you have a spike of emissions at specific points. And a recent study showed that these emissions would amount to the same as if we had waited to 2038. So it's not really clear what the benefits are. So it looks like the federal and the land governments have made a very bad decision here, and it's a pity. Well, if you don't know, this was about expanding mining in a specific part of Germany, and a small village will be destroyed for that in Northern Westphalia. Just one thing on that. We have issued a complaint to the European Commission under subsidy law. It's not really clear that they can even do this, and the European Commission hasn't decided whether these payments are even compatible with subsidy law. So this was a bit too hasty, over hasty, this decision. I don't think it will last. It'll survive. So 20 minutes past midnight, the decision will come. So it hasn't come because it's not yet the 2nd of December. So Gerhard Walter has also asked a question that I believe is important. And I would like to ask Hannes Jaenicke to say something about this question. Unfortunately, most people don't see the connection between the meat on their plate and ecocide against animals and animal suffering. How can we make it clear to people that this doesn't mean going without, but this would prevent their own extinction? So at first, we talked about Lützerath. We have a perfect lobbycracy, to call it that. Germany has a turnover annually of 44 billion, and the German food industry spends 2.6 billion on advertisements for conventional foodstuffs. So we have the president of the Farmers Union is probably one of the most powerful actors there, with also the motor vehicle industry. And so our meat consumption has decreased a lot, and there are more vegan products now, and also the turnover of vegan producers is rising rapidly. So of course I am desperate as well, as just like the person who asked the question, because rainforests are deforested in order to plant soy. 65% of our arable land is just used for producing feedstuffs in order to produce meat. So there is something's happening, but it's not enough. We would need to increase VAT to 19% that are normal, and we would have to lower VAT on fruit and vegetable. That may remain a dream, but just in terms of climate protection, this would have to happen. I really like this question. I love this question, and would like to give others a chance to talk to it. Dana, please. I can only support what Hannes just said. It's of course a very important question. I myself have been eating mostly vegan for years now. It doesn't mean going without, and that's my own experience. So I really would support that. But at the same time, just one maybe a little critical point from my side, I'd be careful to look at the individual meat consumption of one person and call that ecocide. That could be your opinion, your personal opinion, but we have to be careful if we talk about one of the most serious environmental crimes, that we don't use it for little things. Of course, it's important to point out how catastrophic the effects of meat consumption are on the environment, etc. But you still have to differentiate between a major environmental crime and what is a way of action, a way of acting that damages the environment a lot, but it's not at the same level as ecocide. So this difference shouldn't be forgotten in order to remain credible. Question to Dana. So if you destroy the rainforest in order to cultivate soybeans, would that be ecocide? Could that be something that would be made punishable by law? That depends on the definition of the crime, of course. But if you assume that in Brazil, large areas of rainforest is deforested in order to cultivate soy, and you find the person who does that, that's a little bit the problem, because either it has to be illegal, banned, and in Brazil, it is not illegal to clear these woods. And along to the definition of ecocide, it also has to be a wanton destruction. And that is something that you have to evaluate. So it has to be disproportionate in terms of the advantages for the population as compared to the disadvantages for the ecosystem. And only if that is really out of proportion, it would be an ecocide. And in terms of food habits of the society, I don't know if courts would say that this is excessive and disproportionate. I mean, I would hope that they do that, but it depends on the individual court and the individual case. So it depends. That's a typical answer from your lawyer. Well, but I think that in terms of Bolsonaro and under Bolsonaro, it would be clear. Wolf, you wanted to say something, and then we're going to conclude. Please, Wolf, you have the floor. Just briefly, for us in our campaign, it's not about judging people, but it's about a deterrent. So the success of an ecocide law would not be the number of court judgments, but the number of ecosystems that we can save. So that was important. And I would like to thank everyone who came, and we had around sometimes up to 500 participants. And Max, please also post the links or send us the links for those who are still listening in the email after the webinar. There will be some links so that you can support us directly by signing our petition, etc. Thank you. I would like to thank you. Just one last question to Jojo Mehta. The following. What about hope? You've been working on this topic for a long time, and you said a lot has changed. Do you believe that we're on the way now towards this ecocide as a criminal offense? So when you get up in the morning, do you believe that we'll be there in 5 years?
Oh, yes, 100%. Yeah, in fact, I don't think I'd get up in the morning if I didn't think that. But no, absolutely. I mean, I think we're already hearing from even quite conservative politicians that they understand that this is approaching. They're actually telling us, we know this is coming. We just don't know exactly when. And the subtext, maybe we don't know if we're ready, but effectively there is this, growing sense of inevitability. And I think there has to be. I mean, we are set for a difficult few decades probably in front of us. And, if as a civilization, we are going to emerge with a workable way of it coexisting with the natural living world on which we depend, we are absolutely going to have some kind of rule that works as a guardrail in the way that ecocide law does. So yes, I believe it's absolutely inevitable. And it's just a question of, discussing with people how they're going to respond to it and, how fast we can bring it in.
Vielen Dank. Das war ein wunderbares
Thank you. That was a great way to wrap this discussion up. I'm not going to say anything else on it. I'm going to send everyone the links. You can sign petitions, watch films. I'm going to send links to all of that. At the moment, I just want to thank everyone and kindly also thanking the interpreters. You can't see us, but you can hear us, I hope. And then thank you to our guests. And also to our guest from Ukraine. I'm really happy to have had you all here, and we had over 100 questions from the audience. Thank you for that. Thank you for the good cooperation. Please keep watching Europe Calling. See you next time. Have a nice evening. Thank you. That was a great facilitator.
Vor allem an die Juristen.
Das hört man selten und das ist sehr, sehr wichtig.
I learned a lot. I'd like to thank the lawyers especially. You don't hear that often, so that's important.